Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, where we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experience. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology who'll be bringing you their perspectives on how digital transformation is reshaping the way we recruit, engage, and graduate learners. You'll hear firsthand accounts of how institutional leaders are developing their strategy, as well as get deeper on the stories of how these EdTech tools are being built to foster better student outcomes. With that, let's get to today's episode. I'm always excited for these conversations that really start to kind of interface with the expansion of the digital infrastructure at institutions, the tech creep, how things are sort of like interoperable in terms of the tech stack and institution. So we'll be centering in on that for this conversation here. But we'll start as we always do. Justin, if you want to briefly introduce yourself, relatively recently minted as the CEO at Gravyty, the journey to get you to being in that role, and then just sharing a little bit about the work that Gravyty does.
Yeah, Dustin, thank you so much for having me today. Justin Beck, based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, right in the heart of the Midwest here. Path to Gravyty, I'll keep it sort of punchy and tight, but long career in the ed tech space. One of my first roles out of college was a K-12 sales rep at Apple's education group. And it was one of my first times getting to see this blend of mission-driven activity coupled with the financial outcomes that you can drive for your family and yourself as part of a large organization. So really saw the impact things like iMovie and in-classroom experiences we're having for bringing students out of their shells. So kicked off this formative time period. I got to see the explosion of online learning at Blackboard during their rise to be the predominant learning management system in the online learning space. Following that, couple 4 to 5 year experiences at both Kaltura, which was an international video streaming solution that was really plugging a hole that the LMSs were missing around delivering video delivery at scale and scope. And so built a sales team there and a CSM team, and we grew that to a $100 million organization. And then I got to go see the administrative side of higher education, working at Salesforce. So working on things similar to Gravyty today around student lifecycle, both from prospective student all the way to donor and alumni relations. That all led me to the global head of sales at Instructure, back in the online learning space, both in the higher education and K-12 for a couple of years. And then I've had this amazing opportunity to join the Gravyty team, which is, for those not familiar with Gravyty, Gravyty sits as the combination of 3 merged organizations. The original Gravyty company was very much focused on stewardship, alumni engagement, and fundraising in the higher education, nonprofit, and K-12 space. So think about a collection of tools that help fundraisers, gift officers, as well as helping alumni departments really connect with their alumni. Our private equity firm that's behind the organization took that Gravyty organization, plus 2 of the leading virtual chatbot experience companies, IVAI and Ocelot, who had sort of jumped pre and into the pandemic as being the most widely adopted virtual assistant chatbot technologies, brought them together under this overarching banner of engagement. And the thing we'll talk about today, because this gets into the silos and pieces, is every higher education institution has their CRMs, their ERPs, their LMSs. You have these core university systems, but then you have this fraction of departmental solutions. You have a CRM that might work on recruiting and admissions. You have a student advising system. So you have hundreds of systems that are all focused on the same constituent. We're kind of sitting as a engagement tool that layers on top of those core data systems to help universities engage better, no matter where you are on that student or constituent journey. So I'll pause there because that was a long description of myself and Gravyty there.
No, yeah, and I appreciate that kind of context there and kind of the quick crash course on Gravyty. And I was familiar with more so IVA, AI, and Ocelot just from some kind of prior exposure. But that idea of, you have the core systems, but you do need to kind of sometimes drive people to do things, drive students to be kind of doing kind of their life as a student, in some of those systems, or just keeping them updated, or, just supporting them through whatever they need. So and even just kind of the acknowledgement that if you can create sort of a like continuity, like a familiarity of like, hey, the same system you've used like the entire time as a student, like we're just going to kind of flip a switch and now you can sort of like continue to engage, or we'll keep reaching out to you in the same way.
Correct.
There's sort of benefit there, or just from like kind of that administrative side of like, okay, like everything's happening, through, one tool and maybe just different functionality of it versus, getting into that silo piece. Cause I think, wanting to get a little bit of sort of the context of like the history and your perspective, certainly through, a variety of roles over
Sure.
the past several years, like that idea of where we're at now is sort of that there has been so much of kind of an expansion of that digital infrastructure at institutions, and sort of the tech creep boogeyman in this kind of conversation of like, there's sort of a downside of like,
Sure.
oh, we've got all these amazing tools doing all these great things, but like,
Correct.
there's some downside. So like, give a little context to this moment, like when it comes to higher ed, institutional, like tech stacks, and how we got here.
You've seen over the last couple of decades this like consolidation, and I'd mentioned a few of them. You've seen central ERPs that took like financial aid and HR and those things that were at one point in time were sporadic systems all over the place. And then you saw learning management systems come into play where instead of everything being on various different drives, or it took about 10 years for everybody to decide, hey, it's really good for students for them to have kind of a central learning portal. Proliferation has still happened though with whether it's recruited admissions or your financial aid system, your housing system, your vending card system, there's still a good mix of things that aren't like super standardized. But when we think about the constituent we're trying to focus on, the student, they just see the university as an entity. There was a large R1 research institution that I worked with just 2 years ago. If you wanted to change your major, you still had to go get a paper form from the one college, march it over to the other. This wasn't something they could go into the ERP and you had to get somebody to hand sign it. And if that didn't work during 8 to 5 hours, like that's a terrible student experience for when you're paying like $45,000 a year for
Mhm.
your college education, or you're taking out significant loans. So I think that's been beat to death around that there is like this proliferation of systems. But what you are seeing over the last 4 years are where are there stitching opportunities that even though there might be a mess on the back end, and I say mess with love and affection because I know that there are so many frontline folks doing incredible work to try to serve the students. Even though it's a mess in the back end, what are the things that universities can do? And obviously we try to sit in the center of that from a virtual assistant perspective, from a integration of data perspective that allows the end result for the student or even for your team to have greater visibility across those tools and those resources across those perspectives.
Yeah, I think that is just an important point to mention, is that like it is relatively recent, certainly, maybe for some institutions more so than others, of like Canvas is now our institutional LMS or something. Like that's the idea of
Correct.
like LMSs have been around for a long time, and even just sort of like the ubiquity of one platform, or the idea that like every course has some sort of like presence in the LMS, whether it's a fully online
Correct.
course, a fully in-person course, whatever, like that's where you submit assignments. That's where you like,
Yeah.
engage with your peers and whatever else, like just, there is still some recency there of sort of like transitions. And I think it is that idea of like, okay, like now we just have like these tools that maybe like have now kind of reined in, or we sort of reach like peak digital expanse or whatever, and now it's just maybe still continuing in like different forms or functions. But like if it is like kind of as simple as possible on the front end, even if it is very complex on the back end of what we're doing,
Sure.
like let's try to just like try to keep things kind of behind the curtain, that the student doesn't need to know like the student information system or ERP or whatever. If they can kind of go somewhere, or interact with the chat bot or whatever else, like they're getting well served on demand 24/7 and whatever else. And we can, build in all the sort of like approvals and, this, that, the other, the way things that kind of route around or whatever. But, the student doesn't need to kind of do the guesswork or figure out like which platform does what or whatever. And so I think that is like the idea that people are kind of grappling with that and figuring out, okay, well, yeah, maybe we need to update things, change things, or just kind of commit to that work, which is sort of like fundamentally different than certainly like the exciting work of like picking the new shiny thing, like, or whatever, or like,
Of course.
whatever else. It's like, well, we got what we got. How do we figure out how to make them, work better together?
100%. That's I got like a real tangible example. We were talking with a mid-tier Midwest institution this week that uses one of our chatbots as an example for their financial aid office. It's not an ever-present chatbot that spans across the whole university, but what they found was that roughly 40% of the questions that were coming to that financial aid office had nothing to do with financial aid. It was about enrollment, it was about housing questions. It actually provided a great opportunity. And this is where AI comes into it of like, AI was underpinning and surfacing, hey, these are questions that, the data that's supporting those chatbots wasn't able to answer. So where can it find additional information on that university's web properties to provide information back to that individual, or also allow that financial aid, that FAFSA office, to be able to be a good steward and partner to other departments to say, hey, some of your housing information is a little out of date. We're getting a bunch of questions. We're gonna set up a workflow that allows us to funnel students over to you. So it just created it's creating a better like collaboration, ultimately with the end student being a better experience, but also allowing a resource strapped, and you've probably heard this on your podcast a million times, a highly resource strapped department at this point in time to be able to better service their constituent, even though they might be not be the steward that answers that question in particular.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're talking a lot about, just sort of like, yeah, like kind of the perfect storm of like, different headwinds, tailwinds, this, that, the other,
Totally.
sort of like, the climate that institutional leaders are facing. And I think that is like certainly just a big part of it is where it's like, well, even if we wanted to, like we are resource strapped and we can't be getting all these bright new shiny tools. So like, it's just sort of a acknowledgement of like, well, we have what we have. We need to just make sure,
Mhm.
yeah, we're kind of optimizing them. And I think that is like, kind of a spin that I want to take on this next question of what you kind of teed up is that
Sure.
idea of every department and school, college, whatever, maybe having kind of different tools and things that they're using. So there's that sort of like, I think that's kind of an aspect of like tech creep, is that like everybody's sort of like just grabbing kind of tools that they're individually using and that's sort of scratching their own itch. So I think with what you were saying of like, okay, there's this financial aid chatbot that, is getting a lot of questions that they didn't really anticipate. So how do we sort of like, kind of grapple with that and try to solve for that? And I think it is sort of that balance is not maybe a fully either or sort of question, but it's like, I think there is always that dilemma. And this is what I'll put to you, just sort of like, working through this is like that idea of like, okay, we have like the one institutional thing, like the one chatbot platform and that's it. And everybody uses it versus like every department figures out their own solution. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. Like,
Sure.
how does that sort of like hit with you, I guess?
It draws me back, and this is where I start feeling my age. I don't feel like I'm that old, but then you see some of these patterns in the higher education space. Sometimes I think back to like the early days of the learning management system, in particular, on like when publishers and third-party tools, and there's a host of them, were all like having to do these bespoke one-off integrations, and then they built like LTI connections, and this standardization emerged to allow the interoperability that helped with both accessibility. It helped with affordability of like deployment, so on and so forth. So I think we're ripe for another interoperability movement across these like enterprise tech stacks right now. Of like there are strong, and again, not to get too nerdy, but there are things that can lighten the lift at the institutional level from like a middleware. Nobody wants to talk about middleware, but from like a middleware layer that leverages heavily on interoperable standards for connection back and forth, as well as leveraging AI to scale the bidirectional data sync that needs to happen amongst those systems. Because I think one of the most important things companies like Gravyty and our peers and other like technology tools that work in the education is one of the best things we can be doing right now is being good stewards of data flowing back into the CRM, data flowing back into the ERP, because there has been a rush of investment around student success platforms over the last, EAB and Starfish. And you go see those folks, and there's really great analytical models that are in place to really help do frontline interactions with students. But the stuff we're trying to lean in, where I see a lot of institutions really leaning around are what are the things we can do at scale that are a little more transactional, that are surfacing maybe not the, hey, we ran this algorithm and these are the 30 students, but how do I make the day-to-day experience for the students a little more impactful and a little more seamless, much like they're having with their Starbucks app and their Uber Eats app and all the things. I've got a college age, a sophomore in college, and his collegiate experience and his university is woefully behind the times. So I'm not going to say where he is on this podcast here, but he is woefully behind the times, and so is stitching together some of these student experience elements.
All right, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. Forsyth Technical Community College was juggling siloed systems, fragmented data pipelines, and manual workflows across marketing, admissions, and CRM operations. Then they deployed Bolt Agents, Element 451's AI workforce platform. The result? These agents handled over 80% of student inquiries independently, saving 183,060 human minutes, and cutting call volumes by 14% within just 1 week of rollout. Curious what your AI teammates could look like? Try an agent today at element451.com/agents.
Yeah, and that's what's always crazy, I think, is like when you then are now like a parent of a college student, or you're like going through like a college search or whatever, like,
Totally.
where it's just like, oh, well, yeah, like I had my point of view. Like I interact with the people that work in these kind of places all the time, but like, what's
Yes.
the actual like lived reality? Because I think there is sometimes a lot of like, like earnest kind of aspirations or hopes and dreams or whatever. We're like, yeah, we've got these tools, we're doing this, and whatever else. And it's like, well, the reality of it, because I think that's the idea of sort of like the pitfalls or sort of the danger is like, if you're not doing the things that you mentioned around like interoperability or just sort of like, the seamless integrations or just, just like thoughtfulness around like student journeys and like how you're,
Correct.
kind of being of service to the students to like, reach out to them, be proactive or just be, really accessible and responsive, whatever else. It's like you end up like having all these different tech tools and whatever else, whereas like, they're not speaking to each other. It takes a lot of work on the administrative side. The students are being kind of ill-served, or you just see sometimes where it's like, yeah, you have this sort of like marginal people where like they'll just figure it out on their own. Like, okay, I'm like the staff member that has to manage all this stuff. I kind of jerry-rigged some sort of way to get like data to flow or this, that, the other. It's a little imperfect, but like I'm getting what I need. And then students like kind of in the vacuum, they're like talking to each other of like, wait, how does this work? Like, does this count for the major? Or like, where do I go to get this thing, taken care of, whatever else? Like we kind of just have, many of us, I guess, have that tendency, but then the other people just sort of like, yeah, you hit a hurdle, you encounter some friction, just sort of give up and you're like, okay, I guess I'm not doing that thing or, whatever.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's like all those are sort of like the danger zones that we want to avoid, like why this work is important. And I appreciate you giving some examples around fostering a culture where you allow people to sort of like collaborate when they're, recognizing sort of an issue where it's like, oh my gosh, we're getting like, you said like, 40% of the questions we're getting are not about financial aid with this chatbot or whatever. Like, because obviously it's like, you never want sort of like dead ends, like people just to like hit a wall. So it's either like, well, okay, we need to like amp up, the information that we're putting in here or figure out a way to like easily like reroute people or whatever else. So
Correct.
I think those are some of the examples. I don't know if you have anything else around like that idea of like the solutions that you're seeing, whether it's sort of just like the strategy, the mindset, the culture, or kind of more tactical things of like, just improving that digital student experience.
Yeah, and I think about it on maybe a different end right now because it's probably for folks like ourselves that are in that alumni and that space. So, we talked a little bit about obviously a lot of the breaking down of silos and trying to stitch together information so you can be a bit better student experience. One that I think is so prevalent right now is probably on the tail end of that student experience right now. You think about as they transition into being an alumni, like what world is going on right now. You have collegiate athletics, these like explosion of NIL funds and college athletic departments that are like sort of fighting for dollars and attention, sometimes in conflict with their advancement office. Like having worked in advancement shops, as they like to call them, and alumni engagement centers, like depending on the university, you can like you can go to a big R1 research institution. The alumni department might be 3 miles from campus. They are physically and mentally removed from like the campus operations. But who's your constituent? Who's your future steward and donors that are flowing through? So a huge opportunity I've seen where like AI and some of this breaking down silos is actually helping those advancement and those athletic departments be able to capture students as they depart the university. So every fundraising shop, every alumni engagement organization is really trying to focus on like, how do I start building my next wave of donors? And that starts from their undergraduate or graduate experience all the way through their first 10 years of working life. You start laying some seeds and foundations. And I'll give you an example of where like AI has been super helpful for these advancement and alumni, just breaking down silos, was that I won't name the name of the university, but their student information ownership group would not provide the list of alumni of graduating seniors to the advancement shop because it was like a nope, that's our data. So what did the advancement team do? Is they used some AI tools to start scraping information off LinkedIn, off social profiles, where they started building out their own profiles so they could start doing early graduate engagement. What did that lead to? What did that lead to? So this is a customer of ours, and it's one of those times when you're on the phone with somebody and you're like, gosh, are you making an impact? Are we really helping people get places? Because that's like the core mission of Gravyty is really helping on that side of our organization, help people do. And they said, hey, through that scraping, we found a $15 million donation and a $30 million potential donation for somebody that was not on our radar. We like the AI had surfaced information about their profile, gave our fundraisers some additional information about them. Again, there's other technology tools that can help out in that way, but that's one of those where you're like, someone's book that they're managing as a higher education fundraiser just added two new people that they had no clue should have been on their radar. And there was probably getting lost in a sea of email and text messages and all this stuff going on. So great opportunity to break down some silos, kind of force the hand of breaking down some silos in some ways, but at the same time, prove some value for the organization as a whole.
I mean, yeah, to your point of much of the story of ed tech up to this point, there has been, I think, just, that tendency of like, oh, we kind of like suck up all the data and whatever, and we'll show you some amazing like analytics and, dashboards and whatever else. But then it's like, oh yeah, can we get some of that or whatever? It's like, no. Well, whatever. And it's like that idea, and then you sort of like scratch your own itch. Sure. I think, that sometimes sort of forces the hands of like, oh my gosh, okay, yeah, well, we'll sort of like maybe begrudgingly or whatever, sort of give you what you're asking for. And I think that sometimes like works, internally, like at an institution, like from one department to the next, or if you're like working with kind of your external ed tech partners and stuff, like I think it's that idea of like, look what we were able to do. If we could just get it as is, like we would be very happy. It would be like, like it would be great for us, So like, it seems like on one side, like they really had the willingness, the kind of strategy, vision, like in place and the tools and whatever to like reach out to these people. It's just like, we just don't know how best to reach out to them. We don't have the contact information. We don't have anything else. So like, that one missing piece was like really crucial. But then it's like, yeah, you just need to be trying to kind of like, in my head, it almost just feels like that idea of like the digital version of like shoe leather politics of like, we just want to knock on doors and try to start conversations with people and kind of like let them tell us no, because the idea of the assumption of like, well, we assume nobody wants to engage. They don't want to like hear from us or whatever else. It's like, let them tell us that. Like, let's reach out. And then it's like, well, hey, look at that. Like millions of dollars of like potential gifts that are sort of like now able to at least have us kind of go back and forth. I'm like, what does that actually look like? And, whatever else. So I think that is really powerful. And it's kind of, I think something else that I feel like kind of culturally, and I'll sort of just bounce this back to you, but that idea of like, so much of what you're talking about just in whatever sort of like space and place it's happening, but like institutions, I think, have had sort of these cultural norms around like, being super primed to be like reactive, like, hey, we're here. We've got all these support offices and staff members and whatever else that like, we have built it. They will come. We're here to help you versus like, some of the things that you kind of alluded to of like, well, yeah, maybe we have that student support, student success tool. They could do all these sort of analytics and we can try to like reach out to people. But then it's like, maybe it's still like sort of lacking indicators though, like you're sort of like waiting for maybe grades to come in or whatever else. So like, I guess just what's your sort of philosophy around that idea of like, and I think it's very impactful in the alumni space of like trying to be more proactive with the way that you're trying to engage, start those conversations, communicate, with the sort of stakeholders that you're reaching out to versus just being where it's like, well, we have the alumni office. We're here. Somebody just like feels generous and wants to like call us and be like, can I give you guys some money or whatever? You'd be like, oh yeah, sure. Okay. Whatever. So like that idea of like the proactive, reactive sort of like outreach, communication, engagement piece, like any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Dustin, great question. I think I think omni-channel has become the norm. Depending on your age, your generation, your pension. I live in email. That's my life. I'm becoming a better texter, but there's social platforms that kids are on. I'm not on. It's like I'm still the Facebook generation. So it's probably been tried and true of like there is not a one Staples easy button, if you will, to say, hey, this is the path. So what we are finding both at the alumni and foundation level, as well as the campus level and the communication level, is that omni-channel is just a must. And having a college age kids and two kids in high school, I can tell you the text messaging and the app approach are leading the day for them right now. It makes me want to like I physically get ill when I see their inboxes. They're like high school and their university inboxes because it's all this information they should be reading and it's black. They haven't engaged on that perspective. So you have to find ways to like nudge them both from an in-app perspective. And this is where that interoperability ultimately comes into place, is that things are readily available today to do nudges, to do text messaging, to do outreaches, but it all depends on the data that you're feeding it. And so was working with a 30,000 student institution in my home state of Ohio here. And they very simply, through their recruiting and admissions office, are doing nudges through text messages that are responsive to, hey, this person visited our website, they interacted with a virtual experience, so we know where they are on that journey at this point in time. So we're going to do some text nudges, and then next time they show up and are verified inside the app, that nudge is going to take them back to where they were in that journey. Just, it's not intrusive. It's not in your face. It's not 15 phone calls from a, financial aid person to try to get you packaged and signed up. But it's, hey, I'm trying to meet you where you are right now. And the beautiful thing about that is that that's a 24/7 clock. That's not an 8 to 5. That's not a 9 to 5 perspective. So it's those type of little like nuggets and stories. I like using the term, even large institutions that are being like scrappy with those type of things, that it's not these grandiose programs around, we've launched this retention initiative and we're going to have X, Y, and Z. Those are important. Those are super important. But it's the individual things we can do that are personalized on the student level or on the alumni level that ultimately I think have the most like meaning and impact to keeping people on track with their ultimate success goals. Hope that makes sense.
No, yeah, it does. Because I think just with what I was going on of like the proactive, reactive, whatever, it's like omni-channel is how you achieve that, is like, I think being kind of like present in a lot of places, like that can sometimes kind of preempt where it's just like, oh yeah, I've been thinking about this. I'm going to like interact with someone or some sort of resource or whatever else, like start kind of, ideating on that or getting kind of those initial questions answered versus it being like, oh, I'm kind of only reaching out when it's too late, myself as a student, or we're kind of, basing our outreach to people based on kind of lagging indicators or something else. But the really smart kind of intentional ways that you can kind of like, based on your behavior, because that is always, and I feel like I've been kind of repeating it often this year, but the idea of like, your behaviors speak volumes when like you might be doing all these surveys or whatever else. Like students tell us that they want more of this, that, the other, but it's like their behavior, like human behavior tells you way more about like what people like truly believe and want and whatever, because like they're actually doing things, or like, again, they get stalled out, they get confused, they get turned around like on a website or, whatever else. So that idea of like really kind of hone in on that and be really intentional about like, okay, if they do this, they only get 50% of the way. We want to try to like, have them pick back up where they left off, thinking of like course experiences or whatever else of like,
Correct.
Students who, submit all of their assignments early or this or that, the other, or like engage with feedback or do this. Like most students, see improvement in their grades. Cause I think that's sometimes of like, it's either like the context really matters or the just sort of like, so what factor matters. So like, if you can just be really kind of like surgical around those things of like, okay, the student made it like most of the way through, like, with their application or like whatever kind of things we're asking of them. Let's be really specific around like, hey, we need these things. And students who submit before the deadline tend to get like all those things. And it's like, it just avoids things being too generic, or even with some of the other examples that you're talking about of like double dipping. If it's like, oh, we're the alumni office, we're reaching out, athletics actually already reached out and they actually already got a donation, but we don't know that. So we're reaching out like they've never donated before. So like, it's all those sort of things of like, we know exactly who you are, what you're doing, what you haven't done, and like why that matters if you're really earnestly trying to succeed in this course, apply to this institution, get in, whatever else. So I think, all really good things about how you could be really reactive in the right ways. It's not even trying to bemoan that, like being really sort of, mindful of what people are doing, but then also just being kind of proactive, knowing like, okay, this is sort of like a really important time for people to opt into tutoring because it gives you really good leadway before kind of the midterm of the semester to be kind of, really kind of grappling with the concepts. Cause I think, in my experience, it's like students, it's like, oh my gosh, I have a big assignment due tomorrow. Like, can I get tutoring or whatever? It's like, Sure, maybe, but also like you should have reached out like 2 weeks ago. We would have had so much time to make sure that you understand, everything. So yeah, as we're winding down here, your final advice on this topic, you mentioned a little bit about like AI and using it to kind of like, support and things like that. So I don't know if you want to give kind of any kind of honorable mentions as we're closing out on AI, but just anything else, advice for folks listening that you have on this topic.
The good thing is, I think, like in our own research, like 85% of CIOs realize this. This isn't like a major aha coming from Justin Beck and Dustin today. That it's like, hey, us stitching together our systems, us offering personalized experience. But they say, hey, budgets and the fact we're underutilizing some of the tools we have at our disposal today are ultimately what's holding us back. So I think when I get to sit down with CIOs or I get to interact with like even our customer base, the things that like jump out to me are invite some of those core stakeholders to your like planning and design processes. I'm still amazed how many of these like student-centric system initiatives oftentimes never have a student as a part of a beta and alpha, a rollout and a workflow, a customer journey design. The marketers in the commercial world would call it their customer journey. So I'm sort of amazed. And I think my secondary piece of advice is don't chase perfection. Universities are, gosh, I love, because I've made a whole career working in this space. I love them to death, but sometimes they get hung up on the 10% edge use case and the 10% of data that might not be specific, or the 10% of experience, when honestly, the impact on retention, recruiting, alumni stewardship, total student lifecycle happens in the 80% in the middle. And it's those folks. It's not the extreme laggards. It's not the extremely innovative, cutting edge folks that are on the, it's like the 80% of your core student population that arguably is just working their way through and really wants that scaled engagement to help them along their journey. So be scrappy, be bold, and don't expect perfection. I think those are three things that are great advice for provost, CIO, and all the administration that supports those critical roles in our higher education system today.
The action item hopefully is that like you right size your tech stacks. It could be like, oh, we're underutilizing this and that, and like how can we try to like make those adjustments there and maybe give a little bit of sort of windfalls to allow us to get to where we know we need to be, like you said, to create more kind of cohesion across everything. So because I think it's kind of that idea of like it's not a kind of profound like aha kind of thing that we're talking about here, but it is just that idea of like committing to this work is time well spent. How do you kind of keep your team kind of rallied around the cause and really committed to this work? So I think we've done that. I appreciate you sharing all that you did and what ways to connect with you and Gravyty, a description for this episode. So really appreciate you hanging out.
Austin, thank you. Yeah, thanks for doing this in the community. This is awesome.
Thanks for listening to the Higher Ed Geek podcast. This show is a proud member of the Enrollify Network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where higher ed goes to grow. So be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.